Think about the last strange person you saw. Maybe they were talking to someone who wasn't there. Maybe they were shouting at the air while everyone else walked past pretending not to notice. Most of us have been taught to see that person as someone who needs doctors, hospitals, medication, or professional help. Now remove all of that. No hospitals, no psychiatrists, no diagnosis, no words like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Now keep going. Remove cities, remove farming, remove writing. Keep going until there are only 50 people living together around a fire somewhere 40,000 years ago. One of them begins hearing voices. What happens next? Most people think they know the answer. They imagine prehistoric humans were too busy surviving to care, that anyone who couldn't hunt, gather, or protect the group simply disappeared. It sounds logical. The evidence tells a much stranger story. Because for hundreds of thousands of years, the human brain has been capable of doing something extraordinary. It can imagine worlds that don't exist. It can invent languages. It can paint caves. It can dream. And every now and then, it can lose its grip on reality. The question isn't whether mental illness existed before civilization. It almost certainly did. The real question is why the people around that campfire chose to keep living beside it. Most of us don't stop to think about it. We live in a world with psychiatrists, hospitals, medications, and centuries of medical research. Whether those treatments work perfectly is another question. But at least we have names for these conditions: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, psychosis, severe depression. Now imagine taking all of that away. No doctors, no hospitals, no psychology, no written language, no civilization. Keep going backward, past farming, past cities, past metal, past pottery, until you're standing beside a campfire nearly 50,000 years ago. One evening, someone in your group begins talking to people who aren't there. What happens next? Do you abandon them? Do you fear them? Do you kill them? Or do you try to understand them? Most people think they already know the answer. Ancient humans, we're told, lived brutal lives. Every day was a fight for survival. Food was scarce. Predators were everywhere. If someone couldn't contribute, they became a burden. And burdens didn't survive. It's a simple story. The problem is that archaeology keeps telling a different one. Again and again, scientists uncover evidence that prehistoric people cared for individuals who could not possibly have survived on their own. One of the most famous discoveries comes from a cave in northern Iraq. The skeleton belongs to a Neanderthal known as Shanidar I. At first glance, it looks ordinary. Then researchers examined the bones more closely. His right arm had been badly damaged and was probably useless. One hand was missing. He had severe arthritis. He was blind in one eye. His hearing was likely impaired. These weren't injuries that killed him. They were injuries he lived with for years. Think about that. Imagine trying to hunt wild horses with one functioning arm. Imagine climbing steep hills while almost blind. Imagine defending yourself against wolves when your body no longer responds the way it once did. It seems impossible. Yet he lived into old age. Someone shared food with him. Someone waited for him when he walked more slowly than everyone else. Someone decided that his life still mattered. That discovery forced archaeologists to ask an uncomfortable question. Maybe ancient humans weren't as ruthless as we imagined. Maybe survival wasn't just about strength. Maybe it depended on something else. Cooperation. Now here's where things become interesting. Physical disabilities leave marks on bones. Mental illness usually doesn't. A broken leg heals. A damaged shoulder changes the skeleton forever. Schizophrenia leaves no fossil. Neither does anxiety. Neither does depression. So how can scientists know whether prehistoric humans experienced mental illness at all? The answer begins with your own brain. Right now, inside your skull, roughly 86 billion neurons are communicating through trillions of connections. Every thought you have, every memory, every dream, every fear exists because those connections are working together. Sometimes they don't. Mental illness isn't something modern society invented. The human brain hasn't changed very much during the last 40,000 years. The same brain that writes poetry can also produce hallucinations. The same imagination that allows humans to invent music can sometimes invent voices that nobody else can hear. Researchers have found something remarkable. No matter where they study people today, schizophrenia appears with almost the same frequency. Large cities, small villages, remote islands, industrial countries, traditional hunter-gatherer societies. The numbers barely change. Roughly 1 person out of every 100 develops schizophrenia during their lifetime. That consistency tells scientists something important. Whatever causes schizophrenia almost certainly existed long before civilization, long before writing, possibly before our own species. Think about a hunting band of 50 people. Statistically, one of them may have experienced reality differently from everyone else. Not because they were weak, not because they chose to, because their brain interpreted the world in another way. But ancient humans had no medical explanation. They couldn't scan a brain. They couldn't measure neurotransmitters. They didn't know what dopamine was. So how would they explain someone hearing voices? Probably the same way humans explained almost everything they couldn't see. The unseen world. Across history, cultures have filled invisible gaps with invisible beings. Gods, ancestors, spirits, demons, forest guardians. The names changed. The idea remained remarkably similar. If someone claimed they heard a dead relative speaking, perhaps they actually had. At least, that's what their community might have believed. Anthropologists studying traditional societies have found that experiences we call hallucinations today are interpreted very differently depending on culture. In some communities, hearing voices is terrifying. In others, it's the beginning of becoming a spiritual leader. That doesn't mean mental illness is supernatural. It means human beings always search for explanations. When science doesn't exist, stories fill the space, and stories shape behavior. Imagine sitting around a fire one evening. One member of your group suddenly refuses to speak. Days pass, then weeks. They stop eating. They stare into the flames for hours without moving. Today we might recognize severe depression. 40,000 years ago, there was no word for depression, only behavior. The group still had to respond. Ignore them, force them to eat, leave them behind. Nobody knows exactly. But clues survive in places most people never think to look. Not inside skeletons, inside living communities. Anthropologists have spent decades studying some of the world's remaining hunter-gatherer societies. Not because they are living fossils, they aren't, but because they can reveal how small human communities solve problems without modern institutions. Again and again, researchers found something surprising. These groups often survive because everyone depends on everyone else. Children are raised collectively. Food is shared. Older adults continue contributing through knowledge rather than physical strength. A skilled storyteller may become just as valuable as a skilled hunter. An experienced tracker may teach younger generations long after age has slowed their legs. In other words, usefulness isn't measured only by muscles. That may have changed everything for people whose minds worked differently. Because once survival depends on community instead of individuals, compassion stops being a luxury. It becomes a strategy. And that raises an even bigger question. If some people experiencing unusual visions were protected instead of rejected, could those very experiences have given rise to humanity's first shamans, healers, and spiritual leaders? The answer is stranger than most people realize. I'd like to start with a story. Not because it's dramatic, because it's real. In the 1950s, archaeologists working inside a cave in northern Iraq uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal who had been dead for roughly 45,000 years. At first, it didn't seem particularly unusual. Ancient caves are full of ancient bones. Then they looked closer. The man's right arm had been crippled long before he died. His left eye was blind. He had serious hearing loss. Several bones showed evidence of severe injuries that had healed years earlier. Even by modern standards, daily life would have been difficult. By prehistoric standards, it should have been impossible. A Neanderthal with one functioning arm isn't chasing wild horses across open ground. He isn't wrestling large prey. He isn't sprinting after wounded deer. And yet, he didn't die when those injuries happened. He survived for years afterward. Think about what that means. Every piece of meat he ate had to come from someone else's hunt. Someone slowed down to match his pace. Someone protected him during migration. Someone made the decision, over and over again, that feeding him was worth sacrificing food they could have eaten themselves. For decades, discoveries like this have forced archaeologists to rethink one of the oldest assumptions about prehistoric life. The strongest didn't simply survive. The groups that survived were often the ones that learned to cooperate. Now here's where the story becomes much more complicated. A broken arm is visible. Blindness leaves physical evidence. Arthritis changes the skeleton. Mental illness leaves almost nothing behind. You can't excavate schizophrenia. You can't measure anxiety from fossilized bone. A panic attack disappears without leaving a single mark for archaeologists to discover thousands of years later. So if the evidence is invisible, how can anyone know mental illness existed at all? The answer comes from two different directions. The first is biology. The second is culture. Let's start with biology. Every human brain alive today is built from roughly the same blueprint as the brains carried by people 40 or 50,000 years ago. Your ancestors loved. They dreamed. They worried. They imagined futures that never happened. They remembered the past. Their brains performed the same astonishing tricks yours does every single day, which also means they inherited the same vulnerabilities. Modern medicine has identified hundreds of neurological and psychiatric conditions. Some are caused by injury, some by infection, some by genetics. Others emerge through an incredibly complex interaction between biology and environment. But almost all of them depend on one thing: having a human brain. That means the moment our species evolved the remarkable ability to imagine, create language, recognize patterns, and think abstractly, it also inherited the possibility that those same systems could sometimes malfunction. Think about dreams for a moment. Every night your brain creates people who don't exist, places you've never been, conversations that feel completely real. While you're dreaming, your brain accepts all of it without question. Only after waking do you realize none of it happened. Now imagine something similar happening while you're fully awake. Voices, faces, messages, warnings, a presence no one else can perceive. Today we call that a hallucination. 40,000 years ago, there wasn't a word for it. Only the experience itself. And when people don't have scientific explanations, they usually create cultural ones. Throughout history, nearly every civilization has interpreted extraordinary mental experiences through the language available to them, sometimes spirits, sometimes gods, sometimes ancestors, sometimes curses. The explanation changed, the experience probably didn't. This is one reason anthropologists are careful when studying traditional societies. Researchers have found that people who hear voices don't always describe those voices the same way. In some cultures, they're terrifying. In others, they're comforting. Some communities believe they're messages from dead relatives. Others see them as signs that someone is destined to become a healer or spiritual guide. The biology may be similar. The meaning changes everything. Imagine living in a group where everyone has known each other since birth. There are no strangers, no crowded cities, no anonymous neighborhoods. If someone begins behaving differently, everyone notices almost immediately. A hunter who suddenly refuses to leave camp. A mother who no longer speaks. A young man who spends hours staring into empty space. A woman who insists invisible beings are following the group through the forest. Those changes couldn't be ignored. Not because people were cruel, because every member of the community affected everyone else. Small hunter-gatherer bands worked more like extended families than modern towns. If one person stopped gathering food, someone else gathered a little more. If someone became sick, others often shared what they had. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies consistently find that cooperation isn't optional. It's the foundation that allows the group to survive. That doesn't mean every person experiencing mental illness was treated kindly. Human beings have always feared what they don't understand. Someone acting violently may have been restrained. Someone who repeatedly endangered the group may have been isolated. We simply don't know. The archaeological evidence cannot answer every question. What it does tell us is that prehistoric life wasn't governed by a simple rule of survival of the strongest. Instead, it seems to have rewarded something far more powerful: adaptability. Groups that cared for one another survived longer than groups that didn't. Knowledge stayed alive. Children learned from older generations. Experience accumulated instead of disappearing every time someone became injured or ill. And that creates another fascinating possibility. What if the individuals who experienced reality differently weren't always seen as broken? What if, in some communities, they became something else entirely? Because across nearly every continent, long before written history, there appears another mysterious figure: the shaman, the healer, the person who claimed to travel between worlds, someone who spoke with spirits, someone who saw things ordinary people could not. Were these simply religious specialists? Or were some of them individuals whose unusual minds gave them experiences their communities interpreted very differently? No one knows for certain. But that possibility opens an entirely new chapter in the story, because the line between illness and inspiration has never been as clear as we like to imagine. And for our ancestors sitting around a fire beneath an endless night sky, that line may have shaped some of humanity's very first beliefs about the unseen world. There's one more piece of evidence that makes this story even stranger. It isn't a skeleton. It isn't a cave. It's a hole. Thousands of them. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, archaeologists have discovered ancient human skulls with carefully cut circular openings. Some are more than 7,000 years old. Others are even older. The procedure is known today as trepanation, the deliberate removal of a small section of the skull using stone tools. At first glance, it looks impossible. How could prehistoric people perform brain surgery without metal instruments, anesthesia, or any understanding of modern medicine? Even more surprising, many of the people survived. Researchers can tell because the edges of the holes healed while the individual was still alive. That means these weren't accidents. They weren't battle wounds. Someone intentionally opened another person's skull, and they lived long enough for the bone to begin growing back. Why? That's the mystery. Some archaeologists believe trepanation treated severe head injuries after hunting accidents or falls. Others think it relieved pressure caused by skull fractures. Both explanations make sense, but there is another possibility that has fascinated historians for generations. What if some of these operations were performed on people experiencing seizures, hallucinations, or behavior that seemed impossible to explain? Imagine standing beside someone who suddenly collapses, begins shaking violently, and then wakes up unable to remember what happened. Today we call it epilepsy. 40,000 years ago, it must have seemed like something far stranger. The same is true for psychosis, someone who screamed at invisible enemies, someone convinced spirits were following them, someone who wandered into the forest speaking to people no one else could see. Without neuroscience, those experiences demanded another explanation. For thousands of years, many cultures believed illness could be caused by invisible forces, spirits, curses, angry ancestors. Whether those beliefs were true isn't the point. People acted on what they believed. Trepanation may have been one of those actions. Perhaps they hoped opening the skull would release whatever unseen force had entered the mind. We'll probably never know. Bones preserve actions. They don't preserve intentions. But here's what matters. Ancient humans didn't simply ignore suffering. They tried to understand it. Sometimes they were wrong. Sometimes they may have helped. Sometimes they almost certainly caused more harm than good. But they searched for answers, just as we still do. Think about how mental illness has been explained throughout history. At different times it has been blamed on demons, on curses, on bad blood, on the alignment of planets, on childhood experiences, on brain chemistry. Every generation believed it finally understood the truth. Then science moved forward. The explanation changed. That should make us a little humble, because our descendants may one day look back at our treatments the same way we look back at trepanation, not with ridicule, but with curiosity. They may wonder how we could have believed our understanding was complete. The truth is that the human brain remains one of the greatest mysteries in science. It contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each one connected to thousands of others. Together they create memories, language, love, music, fear, every idea you've ever had. The same organ capable of writing symphonies can also create delusions. The same brain that imagined the first works of art can also produce terrifying hallucinations. Those two possibilities have always existed together. You cannot have extraordinary imagination without accepting a certain degree of vulnerability. That's part of being human. And perhaps that's why evolution never eliminated conditions like schizophrenia entirely. For decades, scientists have wondered why genes associated with severe mental illness continue to exist. Natural selection is usually ruthless. Traits that dramatically reduce survival often disappear over time. Yet schizophrenia appears in almost every human population on Earth. Some researchers think the answer lies in complexity. There isn't a single schizophrenia gene. There are hundreds of genetic variations interacting with one another. Many of those same variations may also contribute to creativity, pattern recognition, language, and imagination when they occur in different combinations. In other words, the very biology that allowed humans to become the most imaginative species on Earth may also have made us vulnerable to losing touch with reality. It's a trade-off, an imperfect brain capable of extraordinary things. Now return to that campfire one last time. The fire is burning low. Children are asleep beside their parents. Hunters are repairing stone tools for tomorrow. Somebody is telling a story beneath a sky filled with stars, and across the fire sits a person whose mind works differently. Maybe they hear voices, maybe they speak in ways nobody understands, maybe they frighten the people around them, or maybe they inspire them. Whatever the case, they remain part of the group. Not because ancient humans were perfect, not because every story had a happy ending. Some people were undoubtedly feared, some were probably isolated, some may have died because no one understood what was happening to them. Human history has never been simple, but the archaeological record tells us something many people never expected. Again and again, it shows communities investing time, energy, and precious resources into individuals who could not survive alone. That doesn't prove every mentally ill person was protected. It does prove something equally important. Compassion is ancient, far older than civilization, far older than medicine, far older than written history. For most of your life, you've probably been taught that humanity rose to the top because we were stronger than every other animal. We weren't. Bears are stronger, lions are stronger, gorillas are stronger. We've also been told it was because we were faster. We weren't. A horse outruns us, a wolf outruns us, even a frightened deer outruns us. What made our ancestors different wasn't muscle, it wasn't speed, it was the ability to build communities where individuals could survive together instead of alone. Sometimes that meant carrying an injured hunter. Sometimes it meant feeding an elderly grandparent who could no longer gather food. And sometimes it may have meant making room beside the fire for someone whose greatest struggle wasn't with their body, but with their own mind. The next time you see someone living with mental illness, remember this: they are not part of a modern problem. They are part of one of humanity's oldest stories. A story that almost certainly stretches back tens of thousands of years. A story that began long before hospitals, long before psychiatry, long before anyone understood what was happening inside the human brain. And perhaps the most remarkable part of that story isn't that mental illness has always existed. It's that compassion appears to have existed alongside it. Because the measure of a society has never been how it treats its strongest members. It's how it responds when someone sitting beside the fire can no longer find their way through the darkness alone.